Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be giving you a really powerful and transferable framework for writing. In particular, this is going to help you get really deep master's level ideas down on paper. This is something that I use practically in the academic writing that I do, and hopefully it will be helpful for you as well. So, if you want to launch a really successful and powerful piece of academic writing, you need a few things to make that journey successfully. First of all, you need destination. You need an argument. In academic writing, you really kind of need to be building towards a substantial, interesting conclusion as much as possible. You need a clear aim in sight that you're building towards. Then you need to split down the journey towards that destination into, incremental points, building blocks in the journey of, discussing your argument. Another key thing that you need to avoid this just kind of being hearsay or pub chat is you need clear evidence. You need solid grounds to make the points that you do. You need to justify what you're saying and actually build that argument tightly. But there's another thing that you need as well, which is the somewhat nebulous term that we hear all the time of critical thinking. You need to be thoughtful, you need to be sensitive to the quality of the points you're making, and in particular the quality of the evidence that you're using. So there's a kind of two-part thing here. You first need to actually be quite transparent and say up front exactly how the evidence that you've picked supports your points. You need to be intentional in using that evidence, but you also need to be very aware of how good your evidence is. Does it actually support your point well? Does it justify it broadly? Is it limited? Are there any doubts you might have about that? Okay, so this is PECTA. In essence, you make points, you give those points clear evidence, you think critically about that evidence, and it's all in service of an overall argument. Now, you might have heard similar techniques to this, such as PEAL or point, evidence, explain, and really this is just a variation on that theme. This is quite a broad framework. You could use this to structure individual paragraphs. This actually works really effectively. You begin a paragraph with a clear point, you then, in a subsequent sentence, clarify the evidence, you then think critically about it, and you end the paragraph by making a link between that point and your overall argument. The other thing you can use this for is actually planning out the assignment itself. So, as we will use it in a second, first thinking about your argument, then thinking about all of the points that lead to it, then thinking about all of the evidence that connects to those points, doing the critical thinking, etc. So, for the rest of the video, it's going to be a bit of a follow-along exercise. We're going to model how to use PECTA to plan out an assignment, or one part of an assignment for the Master's module, Teaching, Learning and Assessment. You might be studying on that module, this could be something you use for other writing, but either way, we're hopefully going to help you understand how to use this framework. So, getting stuck into it, if we're beginning in planning a piece of writing, we need to begin by thinking about our final argument. We need to think about the end we have in our sights. So, for the piece of writing you're doing, what is the overall argument? What's the overall claim that you're making? This needs, at least at this point, to be as simple and direct as possible. Writing isn't a purely linear process. When you come to write up your later points, expanding, fleshing out other sections, you will probably refine and develop your understanding of your argument. That's fine, but when we first begin, we kind of need to clarify our understanding of it for the moment. So, to yourself, just kind of take some time, work out what are you actually trying to say. Let's look at a section that we're going to write together as an example. So this is the critical self-evaluation section of the Teaching, Learning and Assessment module from our Masters. And this asks you to write an evaluative essay in which you critically reflect on your own teaching practice and development. So it's a self-evaluation. We've discussed this in other videos, and you are basically building up a case to have certain strengths, certain weaknesses as a teacher, and you're going to be drawing on theories, drawing on examples from your own teaching practice. Here, by the way, are the learning outcomes, demonstrating your competence in various practices as a teacher, reflecting on the learning environment and relationships according to your main examples in your teaching practice, and fundamentally evaluating that practice itself in a critical way. So hopefully you can already see how PECTA might be used here. So as I've said, the first thing we need to do is draw out our argument. So it's good practice to try and do this in a small number of words. So say 50 words or fewer. Punchy statement. What are we saying here? Relating to this assignment, it's got to be an evaluation. So what did we actually try and do in our teaching? Maybe 2 or 3 key areas, perhaps a success and a failure. What were we trying to change? What were we trying to improve? And how well did that work out? And that kind of short statement becomes our argument that we're going to build to within the piece. Here's an example of the kind of thing we might be after. This is an example from my own reflections, actually, perhaps relevant to the video in a sort of a meta way. This year I have worked to improve my own use of models and examples for my students, the intention. This has been successful and positively received, though I have remaining concerns, the evaluation. And you see, I mean, it's quite a tight example, but that's 27 words, so you could get a couple of things in there. Have a go for yourself. Pause the video, have a look at your own assignment if it's different from this. In 50 words or fewer, what are you trying to say? What's your claim? What's the argument? Okay, you got that? Well, the next thing we need to do is think about the points we're going to make in building up that final argument. We're going to have to think about the main stepping stones towards it and, you know, the best order to actually take our reader through what we're trying to say. It's worth clarifying that a point here is a direct step in that argument. It's building the case. It's not just describing something, giving background info. There needs to be a certain element of your voice that comes out, either in argumentation, opinion, or judgment. There are lots of ways of structuring assignments and building up arguments, so we're not going to tell you, exactly all of this stuff. However, you might want to consider that there are some really useful models of thinking already out there. So if you're talking about a specific example of your practice, say a critical incident, you might want to use something like the Gibbs reflective cycle, or even kind of Kolb's experiential cycle can be a good way of structuring points towards a conclusion, taking us through what happened, what were you doing at the time, thinking and feeling, evaluating the good and bad of the experience, analysing why, concluding, etc. There are lots of other frameworks out there that can help you with this. But in any case, we're just making individual points towards our argument. Okay, and we're thinking about what order they might need to be in to make sense. Try and capture these, again, in as few words as possible. So a 17-word rule is useful here. In our case, this assignment, we're thinking about the issue, problem we wanted to spot, what we tried to do about it, and how well that actually worked out. So here's an example. Again, this is from the claim I made earlier. The argument is that I'm working to improve my models and examples, which has mixed success. Well, my first point might be the situation itself. Students weren't doing well last year at applying principles of essay writing to their own work. 13-word clear point. Point 2, so I then decided to provide a worked example, maybe this video I'm using now, to bridge the gap between theory, writing principles, and my students' application of them. Okay, second point. Third point, my personal observation and student feedback have indicated that the strategy has been successful. I'll obviously need to unpack that later, but that's a clear point I'm making towards the final argument. My final point is that I remain anxious, actually, that students might follow the example too closely. Maybe this is limiting their creative autonomy. Okay, 4 clear points, all building towards an evaluative conclusion. So again, take the time for yourself. Try and draft out what are the main stepping stones to your final argument. What order do they need to be in, and see if you can capture them in as short and punchy a statement as possible. Okay, you've got your provisional points you're going to make in your argument. The next step then is evidence. For every point you make in a master's level assignment, you need at least some hint of what your evidence is to support it. There are many different kinds of evidence that we can talk about, and the specific use of evidence is going to depend quite a lot on the kind of essay that you're writing. It will look very differently in, say, a research project as it will in a more practical assignment like this. Now, one way of thinking about it is that theory itself, the reading that you do relating to a subject, forms one kind of evidence, and it will be useful evidence for certain kinds of points that you make. Another kind of evidence is, specific examples, observable behaviours you've seen, say, in your classes. That's another kind of evidence that will back up certain other kinds of points. Okay, let me lead you through this in relation to the example that we looked at earlier. We might need to think about the kinds of questions we could ask of those 4 points, the evidence that's still needed to actually justify them. In point 1, we maybe need to think about how I actually know that students weren't doing well at essay writing to begin with. What's actually the evidence behind their lack of competence there? What did I see? Was it exam results, observations, students' work? In point 2, I've chosen to use this idea of a worked example, so I've got a strategy, but why did I pick that strategy? Maybe there's particular evidence from reading, or maybe I've seen it work in other contexts. Either way, I need to clarify. In point 3, I've actually mentioned the evidence, personal observation and student feedback. But I'm actually going to have to clarify what those actually were. So specifically, what did I observe? What did it look like now that it's better? And can I quote? What was the student feedback itself? What was it suggesting? How do those things actually indicate success? Now in point 4, I say I remain anxious, but I probably need to justify and give evidence, why I'm actually feeling anxious in the first place. What's leading that to happen? And maybe what's the evidence, perhaps from the literature, behind this idea that creative autonomy might be inhibited by worked examples. So take some time, go back to your own plans at this point, and just think about each point that you're making. What is the evidence that will support them? Is it evidence from your reading and theory? Is it evidence from your experience? And how do they actually connect to and justify the things that you're saying? Go have a go at that. Okay, got that? Well, we've formed an argument, we've developed our points towards it, and we've brought in evidence. The next thing we need to do is some critical thinking. Okay, now there's lots and lots of ways to practice this kind of critical thoughtfulness, careful doubt that we might have towards our assignments, but basically it's gently unpicking the arguments that we've made and trying to make them stronger by discussing how good they are. Firstly, you might think about kind of each point, each bit of evidence itself, and think about, okay, are they actually convincing? Is the evidence enough? Is the evidence good quality evidence? Does that evidence actually support the points we're making, or does it actually imply something else? Secondly, we can actively bring in counter examples, other explanations, other perspectives, and we can kind of weigh those up. Are those alternate perspectives convincing? And why? Do they have evidence behind them? And finally, we need to actually be able to reconcile the critical questions that we raise. We need to, think about ultimately what we think and why what we think, is reasonable. We need to kind of be able to end on relatively firm ground, even if we've been critical and gone to some different places. Now, as I said, there are lots of ways to think critically, and you could use all of the words of your assignment by just asking really irritating questions. You're going to have to be quite selective in picking the kind of main lines of critical thinking that you could pick. Here are a couple of prompts of good questions to ask, but not all of them will be relevant for every point, obviously. Could what happened be interpreted in a different way? Are there alternate explanations? Could there be other reasons why things have happened? How certain are you about your ideas? How certain are you about your interpretation of what events mean? And are there any questions that you're left with? These are all kind of useful things to ask. Now, as an example, I've given you a series of points. Let's look at point 3. I made the assertion that my observations and student feedback were showing that my strategy of providing models was successful. Now, I could obviously go and look at that evidence, but if I've got student feedback, if I've got my observations, that's looking pretty tight. I might need to think about, well, why have things actually got better? I am making the claim in my example that it is actually down to my actions, and I think that providing worked examples allows students to internalise standards better. We can look at the Graham Gibbs model of assessment. He says that internalisation of standards is really important. So I've got some theory behind it. I could also say that the opportunities of worked examples in class allows students to discuss tasks with their peers. So there are some particular effect sizes in Hattie's literature that could be connected with verbalization and questioning in class discussions. So those are my points. But are those the only points? Are those the only explanations? There could be lots of other reasons. Maybe there's an increase in student confidence from the methods that I'm using. Just internalising standards itself may not be enough for improved performance. And maybe it's all actually down to just more time on task rather than the particular kind of activity I'm using. You can see I'm kind of opening up other areas of debate. So go back to your essay plans, have a look at the points you're making, have a look at the evidence behind them, see what kind of critical questions and discussions you can start. Give you some time for that. Okay, before we move on, it's worth just considering how we can get space for more critical thinking in your assignment. This is one of those phrases, these aspects of thinking that's a real hallmark of master's level writing, say as opposed to undergraduate writing. One of the things that you might need to do is to be really ruthless in the other parts of your assignment, cutting out all unnecessary description, waffle and repetition. You really need to use your words wisely in these kinds of assignments so that you have the space to do the critical bit. Also, really try to be clear in how you're interpreting your evidence. Don't just kind of give us a quote, give us a theory, or give us, say, a behaviour or a description and leave it to speak for itself. Always try and give us your own voice, your own opinion on things, because then that opinion is the thing you can doubt with critical thinking. Be specific. Don't just kind of leave things vague. Try and be as clear and precise as possible. And, as I've said a few times, try and use counter-arguments. Actually get a substantially different opinion to your own, and then try and reconcile those two perspectives. And, think about why you find your position overall more convincing than the other one that you've brought in. So, finally, we need to return to our argument. We've built up our points, we've given evidence, we've been critical. At the end of each of those little kind of paragraphs or sections, we need to make it clear to the reader and to ourselves how what we're saying actually relates to our final argument. There needs to be a clear kind of train of thought from an individual point through the discussion, the thinking, the evidence, and then back to our destination. You might actually just want to close all of your sections and paragraphs with a sentence actually lining up to your final argument. It's a really nice practice to do. So you can review each little arc of PECTA that you use in the assignment. You will also want to review the entire assignment itself. So this might be a good chance to step back from the plan you've developed and really, review it in light of your argument. Is it clear that you're kind of building up towards that final argument? Is that argument, evident and clear throughout the piece? And is it clear that you've actually earned the right to justify that argument? Is the evidence and the discussion there? You might need to go back and tweak your points. You might need to add in some more evidence. You might actually need to refine your final argument in light of the discussions that are here. Either way, take some time, really review what's here in front of you. Okay, so we've done a lot of thinking. You've hopefully had a good chance to build up and then review plans for a particular assignment. I just want to end by showing you how this could kind of look at a top level in mapping out an assignment, this evaluative assignment that we've been using as an example all the way through. So I've gone and done a little question map according to PECTA that would guide you through, what you're kind of writing about. I personally find questions really helpful when writing, and I kind of do this for every piece of academic writing that I end up doing. So there's a progression of points down the first column, and these almost indicate our kind of main paragraphs or main sections at least, and then connecting to each of those points we have the evidence for it and we have the critical thinking. So if we're evaluating our practice, we need to start off by establishing what was the issue, what was the problem that we were trying to spot. We might need some evidence there about how we actually knew that issue or problem was an issue or problem. How did we actually know that? What's our evidence? The second section would be then, okay, what did we actually plan to do about it? Some evidence perhaps from the theory about why that strategy would reasonably be useful, and maybe even a bit of critical thinking about, okay, why not any other strategy? What's behind this one in particular that is so compelling? We would then move on to a section of the description of the event itself. So what actually happened when we tried it, and we want to draw on specific observable evidence from the room, observable behaviours. So what did that actually look like in practice? Then we might want to consider, in building our evaluation, what were the strengths of our approach when we actually tried that thing? So again, what in the room, observable behaviours, what in the room told us that it worked? And maybe why did that work? Is there a kind of theory we could provide as an explanation? We could be equally quite critical at this point of those strengths. So could what have happened be interpreted in any different ways? Are there any other reasons why things happened? And how certain are we about the ideas themselves? Okay, we can basically repeat that structure for as many strengths of the approach as we want to talk about, and equally we could repeat that structure for weaknesses of the approach. What specifically didn't work so well, what told us that it worked in observable behaviours, what explanations from the theory we got as to why it didn't work out well, and then again the same kind of critical lines of questioning would work. And you could see we could just kind of repeat little paragraphs in chunks that would kind of give us that elaboration. And finally, we want to kind of clarify from the experience, what overall have we learned? So how was this actually all building together in our minds? What we're taking forward, maybe if the situation was to repeat again, or if there were going to be different situations, could we translate our learning into other areas? You might want to be critical here in linking what happened in this specific example through to other examples and experiences. Maybe a particular weakness in this example actually relates to something that's quite common in your teaching practice generally. There might be some thinking you need to do around other experiences that you've got, and there might be other questions that you're left with as well. Then basically your final conclusion would be your argument. What were you trying to do? How well did it go? 50-word or summary. Boom. There you go. Well, that's certainly been a lot of thinking about writing. We've been going through PECTA, point, evidence, critical thinking, argument. As I said, it's quite flexible. You don't feel you need to structure every paragraph according to this exactly, but it's one way of thinking about how to organise your thinking towards a really kind of solid master's level conclusion. Hope it's been clear, hope it's been helpful, and if not, you can always get in touch and chat your ideas through with us for your assignments. Have fun with it. We will see you soon.